On today's Join Us in France, Elise and I talk about Art Nouveau in France. So it's Art Nouveau for the new year. This is Join Us in France, episode 97. Hello, I'm Annie.
And I'm Elise.
She's shaking her head no. Why are you saying no?
I don't know. I think I've changed cultures and I've gone to a culture where you shake your head this way for no and the other way for yes. Don't ask me why. Too much coffee. I don't know.
It's true. I gave her one of the strong Nespresso coffees this morning.
Yum, yum, yum.
Anyway, on today's show, we are going to be talking about Art Nouveau.
Nouveau, yes.
And this is on request from a listener, David Palachek, who sent me an email, who said, I've been listening to your podcast for over a year now, and I can't tell you how much it's meant to me to have such a wonderful learning resource about a country I dearly love. Your insights have really helped my family make the most of the time we've spent in France, and we are looking forward to being back there in January.
Wow.
So this episode will come out on January the 2nd or possibly the 3rd because I come back from the US on the 2nd, so I might put it out a day late. We'll see. And then he also says, as a designer, I would love to learn more about Art Nouveau, the French Art Nouveau movement, especially Hector Guimard.
Guimard.
Yes. He's always wanted to see his work in person, but he does not know very much about it other than metro stations. He doesn't know how much still exists. So hopefully we'll be able to tell him a lot.
I think we'll be able to tell him some nice things about that.
Excellent. So what have you been up to?
Well, as we are at the beginning, no, not the beginning, we're almost upon Christmas.
Yes, as recording, we're recording
right before, about a week and a half before Christmas. Yeah. One of the things that I actually like, even though we're in the South where it doesn't get too Christmassy when you look around you, but one of the things I really like is the Christmas markets. We did, of course, do a podcast on Christmas markets last year.
Yeah.
But here in Toulouse, we have a fairly nice one. It's pretty big. I think it's 100 little cabins or whatever you call those things.
Chalet.
Chalet, yes. Chalet, yes. And lots of lights. And one of the things I love best, of course, is the hot wine. Sorry, I'm a little bit of an alcoholic, I guess. No,
she's not.
It's kind of nice. And this year, they've expanded it. They've actually put up some craft stalls on Place Wilson.
Oh.
And a couple of other places as well. So, and there's more decoration. Now, I'm not particularly fond of our new mayor because he has done a lot of cutting of the budget for cultural things and some terrible things he's actually in the process of doing. However, one of the few things that he's done that seems to be very nice is he's added a lot more decoration to the city.
Okay.
Really beautiful colored lights and things like that everywhere.
Yeah, and there's the goudouli,
right,
with the
that strange sculptural thing around it, and just
I'll put a picture on it.
And around there are crafts chalets or stalls. I'm not even sure if they're actually. I didn't really notice if they were actually the chalets, but I thought that's nice because the central Christmas market is fun and it's on the Place de Capitale, but it's extremely dense and I thought it was kind of nice. You know, I got off the metro and I was walking through Place Wilson and I went, there's some really neat little crafts things. And they were really genuinely crafts things.
So that's good, yeah.
That's good. So I like that. You know, I like the spirit. And of course, being originally from a place where it's supposed to be cold and real wintry for Christmas.
Yeah.
That's something I tend to miss no matter how long I've lived here. It's that you don't get that edgy wintry feeling, you know, so I kind of like that, and it adds something.
Yeah, Christmas in Toulouse is more like an Australian Christmas, without the heat. It's not hot.
Have you been to Australia?
No, but it's summer.
Yeah.
right now. So they do Christmas under, the palm trees.
Well, even in the West Indies, I mean, think about
Yeah.
it. If you go to the islands, I guess it's in the palm trees, I mean, put Christmas lights on your palm trees and whatever, Wear
Sure, why not?
a Santa Claus bikini, I guess,
Yeah.
I mean,
And I haven't put out. Usually, I decorate for Christmas, but I haven't been. I've been gone. One reason why I haven't. But also, we're going to the U.S. for Christmas,
right.
So I thought doing all that decoration
and then just leave it.
Yeah,
It's
we
a
won't
shame,
be here
right?
for Christmas, and so I just didn't do it. I have
I love your poinsettia.
I have a poinsettia over there. That's it. That's the token Christmassy thing. in my house.
Let me just a comment about poinsettias because I was admiring it in its beautiful pot, and I in the other years, this year didn't get one, but I've always bought one. The French don't really know very much about poinsettias. They think it's a weird thing, and everywhere in the States you have poinsettias at Christmas time.
But you do too here now.
Yeah, it's just starting, But they look at it. The first year I brought one home, my husband went, "Well, what's that?"
Yeah, it wasn't really associated with Christmas, but now it's getting to that point where
I don't know its origins, but it's obviously a tropical plant.
Is it?
Yeah. So I wonder if it's a plant that comes from someplace closer to the Americas. I don't know.
Maybe.
It'd be interesting to know.
It's just pretty.
It's just very, very pretty. Yes, it is. And of course, it's just those beautiful red leaves that are so nice,
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's the moment. This is we're coming to the end of the year, and I've been eating a little bit too much chocolate.
Me too. Some of it is your fault because you bought us box of chocolate.
I did. I'll probably be buying you another box before the year is out, so you better watch out. This is your punishment.
If the show is helpful to you and you'd like to show us your support, make your Amazon purchases through Join Us in France. To do that, go to joinusinfrance.com and click on the picture on the left-hand side of the website. Right now, it's a picture of the Paris Metro. Merci beaucoup. All right. Okay. Art Nouveau.
Art Nouveau.
Yes.
Okay. Well,
I'm going to learn a lot because I really don't know much about the history of art.
I mean, but you can recognize some of it. Let's just start with the fact that it's called Art Nouveau. I've been teaching a class in the history of French painting to some American students, very nice young people, and one of them said to me, if I translate Art Nouveau into English, it's new art. And I said, it doesn't work actually, because new art can mean just about anything, you see. Yeah. So let's consider that the term Art Nouveau is a kind of label, which means it's, that's the real name. Don't try to translate it into English or anything like that.
Yeah, it's called Art Nouveau.
It's Art Nouveau.
Yeah.
But the thing is that it's it's a movement of art that actually existed from 1890 till just about 1910, which means that it didn't last very long. It lasted at most as an official movement just about 20 years.
That is pretty short.
It's pretty short. It had certain lasting influences, but not as many as you would imagine, considering how identifiable it is as a style. But what's really interesting to know is that it's a movement that was an international movement of art that basically was pretty much a spontaneous thing that started, believe it or not, in Scotland. And moved into France, Holland, Belgium, Austria, where it was very, very important.
Yeah.
And Germany. And in each of those countries, the movement was called something a little bit different.
Oh, I see.
So the term Art Nouveau is specific really to France and this French-speaking Belgium.
Okay.
In England, it was called the modern style.
The modern style.
Yes.
Okay.
And so one of the things that makes people confused sometimes is because these are terms that can apply to a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And the modern style, with a capital M, when it's the name of a specific movement.
Right, proper name.
in architecture really doesn't mean this at all. It means something else. So it gets people really, really confused. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try and give a little background information, especially as it applies to what happened in France.
Yeah.
And then we can mention the names of some specific people who were involved in it, like this Hector Guimard.
Yeah.
And where there are things that you can see, because it's really an interesting movement. So Art Nouveau is a movement that began actually in Scotland with a man named Mackintosh.
I love it.
Isn't that wonderful? His
Yes.
name was Mackintosh, and he was a fabulous, fabulous architect and designer. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But it's a movement that was very much a sort of spontaneous eruption, if you want to call it that, of artists and designers in different countries who were all reacting to what was the official style of the time. And there are two things that happened, and it's very interesting because, like a lot of other of these movements, and this is of course a movement that only really officially lasted for 20 years, again from 1890 to 1910, there was a manifesto written.
Okay.
There actually are texts.
Oh, manifesto. Wow.
Well, manifesto is probably too strong a word. There were documents written about the theories and the ideas behind what it was supposed to be.
Okay.
And so now, when people think of Art Nouveau, correctly, most of the time, people think of things that are curves.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
And of course, in France, where the actual production of what things were in Art Nouveau was not the same as in the other countries, everything is indeed curves. So much so that the detractors of this movement, the people who were the art critics and the journalists who hated it, and every single art movement always has detractors anyway.
Of course.
They called it the wormy movement, you see. They couldn't stand the squiggles everywhere, the curves. And of course, the reason why is because one of the edicts of Art Nouveau in France and in Belgium, and I'm very specific because it was not the same thing in Scotland and it was not the same thing eventually in Austria. One of the things here, which also applied, of course, to Catalonia, which is why, as you mentioned off mic before, Gaudi is a perfect example, is that they wanted to use nature as their inspiration.
Right. It looks very organic.
It's very organic.
Nothing, I mean, you visit, I've had more exposure to the Gaudi,
right?
Because I go to Barcelona often, and nothing is in a straight line.
Nothing is in a straight line,
and it's beautiful.
It is literally the idea was to reproduce forms from nature, and in nature there are no straight lines. There aren't. I mean, even if you think about it, maybe a trunk of a certain kind of tree is the closest you would get to a really straight line. But the idea was to reproduce organic forms from nature.
Yeah.
But backing up a little bit, this is what makes it so interesting. The biggest movement, the one that's the most important and the one that probably stays in most people's minds of the 19th century is, of course, Impressionism, which was a movement in painting. Impressionism also influenced musicians and composers a little bit, so that you get people like Ravel, then eventually Debussy.
Yes, layering of sounds.
Satie. These are the three French composers whose work is really included in the world of Impressionism.
Yes.
And you know more about the technical terms to use for music than I do. But the other thing that happened in the 19th century just what I wanted to say was that Impressionism, aside from being a movement of painting and music, was not a movement that affected design or architecture at all. It was not a what would be called a multifaceted movement. It was a movement that really involved personal expression, which is why for composers of music and painters, it was very, very good movement. The other thing that happened, though, in the 19th century, which is the opposite, literally, of what the Impressionists were doing, is the enormous growth of industrialization.
Yeah.
So you have a huge development of factories, of railroads, of everything connected to a very much mechanical industrial life. And these two things were the major developments of the 19th century. And what happened was that both of them produced very strong movements in art, because the opposite end of Impressionism is the development of photography, is the development of a lot of neoclassical architecture, very big, very, very strong, kind of overwhelming. Even the Eiffel Tower, even though it has a largely curved form, was part of this mechanical industrial world.
Sure.
Bolts and iron and things like that.
Yes, and the large size.
And the large size. And a group of artists decided that the world was going in the wrong direction. This sounds familiar because, ironically, of course, we're talking about now, 125 years ago. And they were opposed to mechanical reproduction, mass production. And they wanted to go back to a world which probably never existed, but they thought it did, or had existed, in which art, architecture, and design were all one and the same.
Right.
And actually, this is an idea that's much more Asian than European, because in Japan, this is how things were, and this is still, to a large extent, how things are today. There is no linguistic difference between art and objects that are beautiful, objects that are useful at the same time.
Okay.
You know? And so what happened was, that is why one of the other names for the Art Nouveau movement is the arts and crafts movement.
Oh, okay.
Okay? And that is one of the terms that was used actually in England. And England and Scotland both developed very strong proponents of this movement. And what their ideas were, there were three things that were important. One, to do things that were made with great care and handmade.
Yep.
So that you don't have industrial mass production.
Okay.
The other was to go back to organic forms from nature. And this is strange because, in fact, it was based on a kind of spiritualism, which also, strangely enough, this is not in France, but in England, you know, the end of the 19th century was the time when even very well-educated people believed in fairies. You're just going to laugh. I knew she was going to laugh.
Nice.
Little
Why
fairies,
not? Yeah. They're cute.
They're cute, right? So there was actually a revival of spiritualism, which included all the nonsense, you know, excuse me, but the nonsense, you know, with seances and, you know, all of this kind of stuff. And somehow this got incorporated into this idea of the organic world. In poetry, there was a man whose poetry is actually still very, very important, named William Blake. And William Blake was an interesting person in England because he not only wrote poems, but he illustrated his own poetry. He was an artist and a poet. And his work falls into this category as well. There's this strange kind of mix of organic and spiritualism and handcraft. And in France, one of the things that had happened was that in the 19th century, there were some wonderful engineers. France has wonderful engineers who had invented cast iron and reinforced concrete. Both of those things were invented in France by French engineers. And so there was this enormous push to do everything industrially. And so there were these artists who said, no, we don't want to do this. We want to go back to lovely objects that are carefully made.
Okay.
The only problem with that is
it's hard to make enough.
It's not just that. It's that obviously you're not going to be able to do this for the masses. This is
no.
So in the end,
you can only make so many in a day.
It is in spite of the elements of the whole movement, which are really quite beautiful, it wound up being something that was really the contrary of what people thought it was going to be, because it wound up being a movement that was really only for the elite, because it was only the elite that could afford to buy gorgeous handcrafted objects.
Right.
But the main thing...
because at the same time, Ford was trying to mass-produce cars for the masses.
But this is in the United States, and Europe at this point
didn't have that yet.
Not only doesn't have that, but they're not interested in American ideas. And they're certainly not interested in those kinds of ideas. I mean, there's a real separation between European thinking still and American thinking, which is, as far as the Europeans are concerned, and especially the French and the Germans, I think at that point there's this idea that Americans don't have any culture, and so whatever it is they're doing, technologically it may be very interesting, but that didn't interest them at all.
Okay. All right.
Now, but the other thing, and this is the part that is, for me at least, the most interesting thing about it, is that it's an all-inclusive movement, which is really not what had been going on. Ever since the Renaissance, there has been a separation between those people who paint, those people who do architecture, those people who do objects. And all of a sudden, this is an attempt to revive a spirit that is a Renaissance spirit. That is, the same person can be both an architect, design beautiful furniture, and then eventually design decorative things like posters or do paintings or things like that. And so it becomes an all-inclusive movement.
I see.
And that is what makes it the most interesting of all. So in France, you have people who do posters, and that is one of the things that most people still to this day recognize from that time period. And I'm sure that you'll be able to put up a couple of gorgeous examples because there are zillions and zillions of these
right?
posters, absolutely beautiful.
For example, give me an example of.
I think I sent you one or two, but you have posters that are.
Oh yeah, that beautiful woman.
The beautiful woman, right?
Yeah.
You have all those curvy women with the long hair, very sinuous things, very Japanese because they were in fact inspired in a lot of their curves and everything in their coloring by Japanese art. You have ads for things. Now, Toulouse-Lautrec was not new Art Nouveau, but he was one of the people who influenced the ideas that became Art Nouveau.
Yeah, he was earlier.
He was not. He was at the same time. I mean, he actually did his posters between 1890 and 1900 because he died in 1901. But he wasn't. He was very much influenced by Japanese art. But the people who went into Art Nouveau took some of those same kinds of design elements with the curves, the sinuous lines and things like that he actually had taken from Japanese art, and they used them themselves. But you'll see they're very colorful, they're very sinuous, they're very, very beautiful.
I see what you mean, though. Yeah, it's kind of in the same style.
It's kind of the same style, but much more exotically erotic, I'd say. I mean, it's not, his were much more illustrative, So you have posters, you have architecture, which is one of the main areas of Art Nouveau. And if you go to Paris, and you walk along the boulevards, the Haussmannian boulevards, the boulevards that were cut through in the 1860s and 1870s, by General Haussmann, all of the houses, the beautiful apartment buildings that were built with gorgeous ironwork railings on the outside, a lot of them, those that were built between basically 1890 and 1910, are Art Nouveau, and you can see that they have these gorgeous curves over the doorways. They have curves over the windows.
Yep.
It's either made of stone or it's made of reinforced concrete, but it's very elaborate. There's looks like bowls of fruit and flowers. I mean, it's a little bit over the top because they couldn't get away from the design elements that had been used before completely. It's not very clean. It's not very simplified. That comes later with the movement that follows Art Nouveau. But one of the things that's fun to do when you walk around Paris, and one of the areas that I know very well is the area of Boulevard Saint-Germain. If you walk along parts of Boulevard Saint-Germain, you will see lots of gorgeous buildings where the date and the date of when the building was built and the name of the architect are on the outside, which I think is great because it's lovely to see that. And you'll see these buildings with these very elaborate kind of curved overhangs over the entranceways and curved overhangs over the windows and everything that's curvy, vegetal, floral. It's very strange. I mean,
it looks very nice.
It's very beautiful. And of course, it's not the whole wall. I mean, one of the differences with Gaudi, and I think Gaudi must have been someone who hallucinated a lot because, I mean,
I don't know.
Gaudi, there are no walls that are straight. You see,
Exactly. Yeah. Even these
literally.
walls are...
I mean, inside or outside. I was
in
saying
Parguel, you have the
walls,
the colonnades. You have columns, and they're all slanted.
Yeah.
You can't line them up visually. I think there's one point where you can line them up.
I don't know, but I mean,
it's very strange.
And the houses that he built, like I said to somebody recently,
no straight walls.
I would never live in one. I mean, I would go out of my mind. I mean, it's one thing to have elements of decoration, but literally, it's like being in a fun house, and it's there's something
like Alice in Wonderland,
very much so,
Yeah, weird.
He really was, out there somewhere, But in Paris, the buildings, of course, are very beautiful, but there's just enough. In other words, it's really elements of detailed decoration. It's not essential to the structure of the building. You don't have inclining, curved walls or things like that.
I mean, it all looks straight. They just do like straight. A portico or an entrance or windows or like that. And they're gorgeous.
And they're gorgeous. And sometimes there'll be they started doing these gorgeous bay windows that had these curves and things like that. And even the ironwork, the cast iron, a lot of the beautiful designs at that time reproduced this idea of this very curvy vegetal kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Which is, it's very beautiful. And it's really, in most of the cases of what I've seen in Paris, just enough to give a certain oomph and a certain class to the building.
Yeah.
But to be honest, that's all it is. I mean, it doesn't...
Right. Once you're inside, you have normal staircases
right.
and normal ceilings and normal everything else.
Right. I mean,
it's
there's
not a gaudy house.
Some molding and things like that make it very interesting, but it does... No, so you have the architecture. And then, of course, one of the things that is most emblematic is in 1900, the finishing of the entrances to the metro.
Yes.
Which was not the first metro, believe it or not. The very first metro ever in Europe was in Prague. But the one in Paris is the first electric one.
I see.
So it's huge, obviously, and so because it is in the height of the time period when this is in fashion, they asked a couple of these designers, one in particular, and that is Hector Guimard, to design, if I remember correctly, it was the first 3 or 4 lines of the metro. I'm not sure how many different lines, but I know for sure that he did lines 1, 2, and 3. Mm-hmm. And he was given the job of designing the entrances to these metros.
Right.
And of course, there are still several that are there. And there's one at...
they're the iconic metro.
They're the
entrance.
iconic metro, right? And of course, it says Metropolitan, in the long, which is what metro stands for anyway.
Yes.
And there's one on Ile de la Cité, right across from Sainte-Chapelle, which is one of the most beautiful ones. There's one at Les Abbesses, which is when you get off to go to Montmartre and Sacré-Cœur.
Yes.
There's one at the Bastille. Mm-hmm. And there are others as well. I mean, now, what does that mean? Well, obviously, and I'm sure you'll post a picture. Everything is curves, right? And everything was made with cast iron. So this is this contradiction between the mechanical industrial age, cast iron, and what he decided to do, which was make these gorgeous lampposts that look like pods coming out of they're flower buds coming off of a stem.
And Elise is curving her head.
And I'm curving, and I'm hurting my hand. And it's very interesting because everything is curved. The overhang, which doesn't exist on most of them anymore, which is a shame. If you go to the metro stop at Les Abbesses, which is line 12, to get out to go to see Sacré-Cœur, it's one of the few where the entire original metro stop entrance exit is there, and that includes it includes the overhang, which is glass and iron and everything else. It's just absolutely beautiful. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people hated it even then.
Why? How can you hate that? People are grumps. Well,
I'm going to tell you something that's actually, I think, hilarious, but some people don't even think this is hilarious. People thought it was too erotic.
Erotic?
Yep, they thought it was too erotic.
Oh, get your head out of the gutter, folks.
And so, there's just when you look at these things, there were actually people who wrote to the newspapers at the time and protested that this was too suggestive.
Oh, jeez.
And so it was too nasty,
There's something wrong with people.
Well, there is something wrong with people a lot,
If you see nasty in that, then
Well, then
no
you see
hope for
nasty
you.
and flowers opening up, which is probably what some people do, you know.
Yeah,
I mean,
probably.
have you take a look at a flower as it buds, out and starts to open up. So all of these gorgeous curves, and here my hands go again, you know.
Yes.
All of these curves that kind of were an S curve with these gorgeous lanterns, which were orange, which offset the green. Why are they green? Because they use
paint, right?
a special anti-rust paint on the cast iron. So they use...
I pity the fool who has to repaint those things. Sending them down has to be one of the most awful jobs.
Awful. Absolutely awful. But I mean, think about the Golden Gate Bridge and the Eiffel Tower that have to be repainted for the same reasons, you know. I mean, so the gorgeous kind of golden orange glass that was used for the lampposts, because at first they were gas lamps.
Right.
Then they were turned into electric lamps.
Yeah.
It's very beautiful when you look at it next to the green. So Guimard, who also did a lot of posters, he was a graphic artist as well. And he also designed furniture. He was one of these people who was a proponent of the all-encompassing ideas of Art Nouveau. And his work, which was, of course, sanctioned by the city of Paris, was actually attacked. I mean, there were people who actually thought it was hideous, absolutely horrible, and
definitely too sexy.
And definitely too sexy. I mean, it was just too sexy. I mean, if anything, it makes me think of science fiction with these pods opening up, and I don't know what's going to come out of them.
Yeah.
But that's your domain, more than mine. But really, thinking of these as being too erotic is a little bit, especially in France, where everything is connected to sex anyway. So what difference does it make?
Yeah.
So we have architecture. There's a gorgeous theater on the Champs-Élysées that is a theater that was made in Art Nouveau style, the theater of the Champs-Élysées. If you walk up and down the Champs-Élysées, which unfortunately now has become kind of just like a shopping mall with chain stores most of the time, but if you get past looking at 5,000 Zaras and H&Ms and things like that, what you have are buildings that were built, a lot of them in the 19th century. And so you have some beautiful examples of Art Nouveau and then eventually Art Deco afterwards too.
Yeah, what's the difference between Art Nouveau and Art Deco?
Well, I was going to kind of save that for the end because the Art Deco is kind of what comes after.
Okay.
So let me wait and just all right. I'll tell you at the end.
Yeah.
So that's it. So we have architecture. We have the metro stops. We have furniture. And
yes.
And one of the most gorgeous things is the furniture that was made with the idea of the style of Art Nouveau. Now, this is where there's a huge difference between what happens with Art Nouveau in France and what happens in other countries. And the best place to go to see some of the furniture is the Musée Orsay, which has a whole wing devoted to Art Nouveau on the mezzanine level, which is the in-between level in the museum.
Yeah.
And it has some of the most gorgeous examples of beautiful furniture.
I see it now. Okay. Yes.
Now, what does that mean when we're talking about furniture that's Art Nouveau? It's all curves and made with the finest wood.
Yeah, it has some beautiful mahogany,
pear wood, cherry wood, all of these beautiful, some ebony too, I think. Gorgeous wood. Very much curves with lots of lines that look like vine lines and things like that.
And that's a part of the museum that's often ignored by people.
There's exactly.
Even if the museum is packed, that area is often pretty empty.
And it's a beautiful thing to see.
It's very beautiful.
Now, this is what happens. So there were people who were very wealthy, who loved this style, and so they got different architects and designers to make a house. And in the midst of making the house, they also designed all the furniture. And now in the States, even though the design style is not quite the same, this would be somebody like Frank Lloyd Wright, who did not only the actual architecture, but designed all of the interiors as well.
Okay.
So in Art Nouveau in France, this is what they did. And you have several people, and Guimard is one of them, who was really somebody who was very involved in kind of what we would call overall project. Now, it's interesting because I was just explaining this the other day by pure chance. One of the things that they started to do, which didn't take, it's interesting, it was one of the things that did not take and did not last very long, was in the midst of doing this kind of furniture, they made pieces of furniture like a perfect example. I'll describe it, and then I'm sure that we'll find an image to show. A bed that includes built-in night tables with little drawers and the huge headboard. Everything is built in.
Yeah.
And the reason why at the time that this was designed, it was a huge modern idea, because prior to that, nothing was built in houses. You had to have either a huge armoire or you had to have extra pieces of furniture, but no closets were not built in, things were not built in. And so this idea of built in lasted basically till about 1930, 1935, and then it stopped being in fashion again.
Well, it's a problem because you have to have custom work.
You have to have custom work, and you have to have very big space for doing a lot of these pieces.
Yeah.
But what they did do was they created an idea of design, and the design not only was for furniture, but one of the areas where it was the most long-lasting and still is interestingly enough, in gorgeous small pieces, and that includes glassware and jewelry. And so we have two people or two names associated with that, and one is Dome, D-A-U-M.
Yeah.
And the other is Gallet. Gallet, G-A-L-L-A-E, with an accent, aigu. You've never heard of either of them?
No.
Lalique?
No.
No, you're not in the world of design.
No, I'm
my
not
dear
at
friend
all.
Annie.
Sorry,
not at all. Okay.
No.
Now, all of these three people who are people whose work I would die to have. Let's put it that way. Just die to have.
Oh, jeez.
Oh
She
God,
has that look on her
I'm getting
face.
that look on my face now. They were people who were designers of magnificent things in crystal, in glass, and in jewelry.
Wow.
And their work was largely centered around not Paris, but the city of Nancy.
Nancy.
Which is in the area of France called Lorraine.
Yeah.
About what?
Northeast.
200 something miles east of Paris. And the reason why it's called the School of Nancy, l'École de Nancy. It's the most important place to go if you are a passionate person about Art Nouveau. You must visit Nancy. Why? For three reasons. Number one, because this is where the original art school devoted to Art Nouveau was created. It still exists. This is where the best museum of Art Nouveau exists. And this is where you have a city that has the most Art Nouveau. In its
beautiful place.
Beautiful.
It has this magnificent Place Stanislas.
Right.
Beautiful.
And so it was an area devoted to Art Nouveau. Now, why Nancy? Well, for reasons that have a lot more to do with technology than anything else, because you make crystal and glass in a place where you have coal, a lot of wood, and a lot of running water. And because the coal mines were in Lorraine, and there are lots and lots of forests in Lorraine. The area became a source for people like Baccarat. Now, you have heard of Baccarat.
Yes, I have heard that. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
You have heard about Baccarat. Baccarat is a crystal maker, obviously. So where they made glass and crystal, it was some of these artists who had studied to be artists, who studied to be designer artists. They decided that it would be an interesting place to do experimentation, very much like the way the island of Murano in Venice is associated with glass making.
Sure, yes.
To this day.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so they created with Guimard, Gallet, Dome, and a group of other artists, they created the School of Nancy, devoted to Art Nouveau. And they turned out exquisite, absolutely exquisite pieces, furniture pieces, gorgeous furniture, pieces that are vases, pieces made out of, and they experimented with the actual physical qualities of the glass and the crystal, so the quality of it. It's interesting because they really had an engineering scientific element to their work. And they still exist, by the way.
Wow.
Lalique still exists. Dome still exists.
You mean they're still alive?
No, the companies are still alive.
Oh.
And the pieces are still produced in the same way, although I doubt if there are too many pieces that are unique pieces because they cost a fortune.
Right, and that's the problem
gorgeous.
with it is if it's unique and crafty, then it's going to cost.
But it's the same as an individual. But in that sense, what we're talking about is it's the same thing as an individual unique painting versus a print. Okay? So if you imagine buying a painting by Monet or Renoir, just to cite impressionist artists, you are talking about, even at the time they were alive, we're talking about a price that's going to be hundreds, if not 1,000 times more than simply a print of their work. So here you have, remember, the arts and crafts movement called Art Nouveau in France is about hand-produced objects and hand-produced furniture and crafts things. And crafts, we know by definition, is more expensive.
Sure. How did these people train? Like they would train as a carpenter?
No, several of them trained as glass makers and artists first.
Yeah.
And then they were interested in, there are special schools for working with glass or for working in woodwork and to be a furniture maker. And then from the skill or the craft, they became interested in the art movement.
I see.
So, and what happened was, since there was already glass makers, I don't know if it was actually a school or a guild. I think it was actually a guild in the area near Nancy. And you have a bunch of architects who were also interested in this. They met, and of course some of them were actually from Paris. And so just like groups of artists wound up hanging out together in the Impressionist times, you have every one of them knew each other. They all hung out together. They started working together, sharing ideas, and that is when a group of them got together and decided they would literally create this school that would be both a school of art and craft. And what makes it interesting from a point of view of someone like me who is interested in all of these things, I mean, I'm as interested in gorgeous objects as I am in painting as I am in a certain way in architecture.
You're artsy-fartsy.
Don't take the fart away. The artsy part is good enough. If you go to Austria, it's the secessionist movement, which included painters like Gustav Klimt.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Love him.
And gorgeous, beautiful architecture. It was very, very, very important, the secessionist movement in architecture. And if you go to Scotland, where this wonderful Mr. Mackintosh was, who created a school, which, by the way, exists in Glasgow to this day, and which, if I'm not mistaken, was last year in 2014 or the year before, had a terrible fire, and part of the actual building burned down, and it's going to cost them a fortune to rebuild it. Mackintosh's work, which was directly part of this, his work is not curves at all, and and he was a designer who did furniture and architecture and all kinds of things like that. And his work is absolutely not curvy at all. And yet he considered himself a member of the same movement. So it's very, very interesting to see how it got interpreted.
So curvy doesn't really define it.
It defines it in France.
Oh, okay.
So if we stay strictly with what happened in France in Art Nouveau, absolutely only curves. Absolutely only curves. Now, what happens is that each of the cultures, that is Austrian culture, Dutch culture, English, Scottish culture, each of these areas, for some reason, starts to reinterpret these ideas in a different way and takes them off somewhere.
Was there some in America too?
There was very little until we get to people like Frank Lloyd Wright, who comes a little bit later, but whose work is... He's almost more, I would say, what we could associate with the end result of this, which is Art Deco. And I'll just explain that in a couple of minutes. But there is Art Nouveau. There's a lot in New York.
Right, that's what I was going to say. I think,
but it wasn't. what should I say? It was copying. Let's put it that way. I mean,
I see.
In other words, I can't think, and maybe it's because I don't think of them in general. And when I think of it, I don't think of any particular artist in the United States that was outstanding in the way all of these artists in France were, or even the people in Scotland or in Austria were, that set off a specific style. They took this idea because, just like in painting, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, Americans basically copied what was being done in Europe. It was not really until after World War I that American art and style went off and developed its own thing.
Yeah.
So even if you think about...
And by now it's French people imitating the Americans.
And after World War II, literally the rupture is World War II. And from World War II on, it's Europe taking American ideas and reinterpreting them. Mary Cassatt was a American from Philadelphia. She went to France and became an Impressionist painter. Sargent, the painter who went to England. These were people who were alive and painting and creating at the time of all of this, or just even a little earlier. But they were not people who developed ideas in the United States. They went to Europe because it was where all the creativity was. So I don't really know, even though there is Art Nouveau in certain parts, there's Art Deco a lot more in the United States than Art Nouveau, because it was an idea that became associated later on with more industrial things. So it took more, it took on more interest in the United States. But just to finish with Art Nouveau, one of the things that happened is that you have the most famous people to this day are the people I've just mentioned. You have people in France specifically, like Guimard. You have a whole group of architects. You have the people who do object design and furniture design. But what happens is, ironically enough, is that at the end of this time period where we're up to just about coming up to 1910, specifically in France, the work starts to get too much. It's too curvy. It's too it's overabundant. Overdone, and it takes people back to the period right before, which is called the Belle Époque, which is if you visit the Garnier Opera House, is what's the Belle Époque. The Belle Époque is literally everything. It's like taking everything you have in the refrigerator, putting it in the soup, and seeing what comes out. And what Charles Garnier did with the Opera House was take a little bit of this and a little bit of that. He took some ideas from Versailles. He took neoclassical. It's a pastiche of absolutely everything. It's fabulous to look at because it's like a delirium. I mean, and it's made with all these very fine materials. And the idea of using fine materials, of course, is one of the essential ideas of Art Nouveau.
Right.
But what happens is that after a while, just like with Gaudi is like the epitome of what happens if you go too far with this. I mean...
Yeah, he kind of did in a lot of ways.
I mean, you have things that are so curved and so overwhelming in these kind of S shapes and vegetal shapes and everything else that people start going, okay, I can't do this anymore, Now,
it's very busy.
It's very busy. Yes, thank you. I was looking for the right word. Yeah. Now, ironically, it works better with small objects.
Well, yeah, because the scale is smaller.
It's much smaller.
It's not like if you had a lamp or
Tiffany. There you are.
Oh, Tiffany is also Art Nouveau.
Tiffany is Art Nouveau, and
love it.
I love it. Right?
Yeah, beautiful.
But it's a lamp.
Yeah, see,
or a window.
In a room, I would gladly have a Tiffany lamp.
Exactly.
I don't, but I would love that.
Right.
But I wouldn't want the whole room to be like that.
No, exactly.
It would drive me nuts. Yeah, like you said, I can't imagine living in that sort of...
It's too much. It's just too busy everywhere. Now, Tiffany was one of the few examples of genuinely being inspired and creating a world of glass based on Art Nouveau ideas. And of course, there was a lot of glass. I mean, this is what's interesting.
And all these colors.
And all the gorgeous colors.
Yeah.
And if you go and even look online at the work done by Dome and Lalique and Gallet, it's It's objects, obviously. Lalique did a lot of beautiful jewelry. It's all with these gorgeous curves, sinuous curves, but it's colorful. It's gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous.
So did they do like glassware and utensils?
No utensils.
Okay.
No, I'll take that back. I'm not sure if anybody tried to do utensils, but these are lots of vases, lamps, pieces that have a function but are not totally utilitarian.
Yeah, okay. All right.
No, I'm sure you can find beautiful silverware that was inspired in its decorative element, at the end, like the end of the stems and things like that, by Art Nouveau, because one of the tenets of the...
I'm imagining a fork, Art Nouveau fork.
Curves.
All curved and the no points.
And the prongs being curved. I don't know if you get to eat very much that way, but the handle could be Art Nouveau.
Yeah, sure.
So, but of course, one of the tenets of the movement was to make something that was beautiful but also could be useful, which is why it was such an important movement in architecture and in design. And then what happens literally is that by 1910, the madness of Art Nouveau kind of gets to a lot of people, and you get architects and some designers, but largely architects, who decide that they have to simplify the forms. And that is what happens when we move into Art Deco, which means decorative arts. I mean, it's also an abbreviation in a sense.
Yeah.
But the other thing that makes a big difference between Art Nouveau and Art Deco is that Art Deco espouses industrial production.
I see.
So you have some of the elements left. There's a use of mosaics in Art Deco. You have a use of curves in the ironwork, which is typical of a lot of Art Deco buildings. Gorgeous ironwork on the doors, ironwork on the windows. There's always a frieze with some kind of sculpture that's in relief form that can be floral. There are usually little details that are either vegetal or floral with some beautiful colors. But the basic lines, including the lines of the windows and the doors, are simple vertical, horizontal lines. And so what they do is they kind of move back from the Art Nouveau world to a world where things are much simpler to look at, and you can just appreciate the small details.
Yeah. So like I'm imagining a beautiful entranceway, but there's more, straight lines and then overlay of
a little bit of glass and beautiful curves of cast iron. There are some very nice examples of Art Deco here in Toulouse. One of the most beautiful is actually the Périgord Library, which was built in 1930, not 1910. But interestingly enough, the Art Deco movement lasted longer. It lasted a lot longer because it really began just about before World War I and moved into modern design.
Right. It had more legs because if you can produce pieces industrially, kind of, you can sell more and it kind of spreads more into the population.
Exactly. And it inspired more other forms. I mean, it becomes all encompassing. In other words, Art Nouveau in the French version doesn't really go beyond the borders of French-speaking world. Literally. There are certain elements at the beginning that are similar in Austria, in Northern Europe, but very quickly each of these separate countries develops a bit of a different idea of what Art Nouveau is. And the very all curvy, over-the-top kind of idea, which includes furniture and everything, for some reason really doesn't go beyond Catalonia, Gaudi, that area, and France. And the rest of it, in Austria, and particularly in Austria and in England, moves away from that after just about 1910. And interestingly enough, other than in France, the other place you can go in France where you can still see a little bit of Art Nouveau, unfortunately not that much because too much of the city was actually destroyed, both World War I and World War II, is Reims, which is on the way to Nancy.
So there you go.
Literally east. Reims is 110 kilometers, I think, east of Paris.
Right.
And Nancy is probably almost 280. You know, I mean, it's much further east.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, both of these are places where there was an enormous amount of Art Nouveau. There is still a gorgeous building in Reims that is it's a theater. It was turned into a movie theater. I actually saw it just a couple of years ago, took a couple of photos of it and kind of went, oh my God, it's a little bit like a Gaudi type thing, you know. I don't think it's that overdone on the inside, but on the outside, everything everywhere is curves, you know. It's kind of, it feels overwhelming. It almost feels like it's going to fall on you, you know.
Yeah. It's funny because it's nature, but it doesn't feel to me from my perspective when you walk into a Gaudi
structure,
Batlo or whatever,
right.
You know, it doesn't feel natural.
No, because it's too much. It's kind of like going into a jungle in a way, you know. I mean, there's a sense that it's a little bit suffocating. I think that's part of the problem with it. It works better, interestingly enough, really in poster work, in that kind of design work where it's on a flat 2-dimensional surface that you can appreciate looking at all of the sinuous curves and all of the very elaborate design. It somehow doesn't suffocate. And it's also, I think that's why it works so much better with smaller objects, because you can look at the object and appreciate the lines on it and the beauty of it, but you don't feel like you're in the midst of this kind of Alice in Wonderland world, you know, where everything's kind of falling over on you.
Was
you
like
know,
that, it would be very strange.
It'll be very strange. You know,
there are people who live in I can't remember if it's the Batlo or some of the other ones in Barcelona, but there are floors.
There are floors with apartments. Yes.
Apartments where people live, and
definitely
they're the same. I mean, they're done the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I don't know. It would be interesting. Well, of course, he was not that young a man when he died, Gaudi. But it would have been interesting to see if people had actually continued with that, what they would eventually have done. You know, would we have had rounded, amorphous shaped windows? I mean, I don't know. I don't really know. But I think
today it's done, right? Nobody does this sort of production
unless you go to places like the manufacturer that like Lalique and Dome and Gallet, which still exist, and you can buy things that are now inspired. I guess we could say they're fourth generation. Maybe we could have to call them copies, even if they're hand-blown pieces of beautiful crystal or glass.
There's glass stuff.
It's all either that or there's a lot of jewelry, too. Lalique made a lot of jewelry.
But not furniture, not
that I know of. Not that I know of. I mean, the thing is, World War I is really a point of rupture for everything. Yeah. And beyond that, between technological advancement, the economic situation in the Western world, the beginning of the 20th century and then into the middle of the 20th century, and then with new ideas that are an evolution out of all of this, people want clean lines, you know, and things like that. And it's a slow evolution that leads from Art Nouveau into Art Deco, which has a lot more to say about architecture. And then eventually what happens later on, because
and it's very funny because you can walk around even in Toulouse on some of these old streets, and all of a sudden here's some Art Deco house,
right.
And it's right in the middle of plain old houses. Yeah. It's very strange how some people, I mean, obviously they got built
at that time,
early, at that time, and they're in the middle of really plain-looking southern Toulouse houses. And then, whoop, here's an Art Deco one, and it's the only one on that street.
There's one small area that's actually technically part of the area called the Busca.
Yes.
That has a whole lot of Art Deco. A whole lot.
Well, because they had more money.
Because it was a wealthy area, and almost all of those houses were built between the very end of the 19th century and 1914.
So in Paris, where would you go if you wanted to see some Art Nouveau, Art Deco? Obviously the metro.
Well, Art Nouveau, you really have to walk the boulevards.
Boulevard Haussmann.
Like Boulevard Haussmann, Boulevard Saint-Germain. There is no other. It's not like in Nancy, which is really exceptional in that there are whole areas that are just all Art Nouveau. It's again something that was used a lot on those big boulevards when they redesigned them. But there's no neighborhood per se. You have to. The area, strangely enough, one of the areas where you can find some very beautiful examples, but they're, as you mentioned, interspersed with other houses, is in the Montparnasse area. Actually, if you go towards Montparnasse, you have Boulevard de Raspail and you have Avenue de Maine. The 14th arrondissement has a lot of later examples of Art Nouveau and some beautiful examples of Art Deco as well, because it's an area that was developed really around that time. And since some of them, or a fair number of those buildings, were not destroyed, they're still there. A couple of them are still used as artists' residences and things like that. But there's no specific neighborhood.
Okay, so it's here and there.
It's here and there. However,
I saw a list on the Hector Guimard Wikipedia page.
Yeah,
they have a list of lots of things that he produced, buildings and such, but a lot of them are gone.
Yeah, a lot of them are gone.
So on the French article anyway, it'll tell you in parentheses, détruit or...
A lot of the metro stations have been destroyed.
That's kind of crazy. Why would anybody destroy that beautiful stuff?
Some of them were destroyed because at a later point they hated them, and so they were taken down.
Yeah.
Some of them were destroyed for, I think, other reasons that had to do with other events in the world, in the 20th century. Why, I don't know.
Yeah,
I mean, basically now it's such a delight to see them.
Yes.
It just,
they stand out. They really
do stand out.
Yeah.
And they also are delightful in the sense that, you're, even when there are beautiful buildings nearby, there's something about them that's...
It's fanciful.
It's fanciful, and it's light. There's a lightness in the sense of weight to these lovely, sinuous, very thin forms that move up and out. Because let's face it, there's a lot of absolutely gorgeous architecture in Paris. But if we're looking at classical architecture from the 17th century, which there's a lot of still in certain neighborhoods, it's gorgeous, but it's not very light. And things that came afterwards aren't particularly light either. I mean, even parts of the Art Nouveau is gorgeous because it's filled with beautiful details, but there aren't too many things quite like those metro exits. They're just really beautiful. There are a couple. If you want to see an absolutely magnificent structure that is Art Deco, it's the Gare de l'Est.
Aha.
It's been refurbished.
So the whole train station.
The whole train station. And it's got just gorgeous ironwork.
That's Art Deco.
That's Art Deco. There is actually, ironically, there are places like the Trocadero, which are basically the end of Art Deco, which takes us into another whole thing with architecture. But I don't know of any specific neighborhood. Now, there might be little places, little pockets in parts of Paris that I am not aware of where there's a concentration of Art Nouveau.
Yeah.
I just don't know.
I'll look it up, and if I find a list...
Maybe in the 20th, that might be. There were a bunch of little things that were... At the end of the 19th century, there were little communities of little, like, alleyways, like the Mews would be in London or something, where they built lots of little houses together, and then there are these little pockets of things like that still exist in Paris, but they're kind of out of the way. You have to go find them. That's one of the things, by the way, that is wonderful to do is if you wander in a neighborhood in Paris that's out of the basic tourist area, and you go and you see alleyways or little passageways, they're wonderful to walk down because you will discover lovely little old houses and very interesting things. There aren't as many as there used to be, but they're kind of fun to do. But again, for somebody who's really passionate about Art Nouveau, you have to go to Nancy.
Go to Nancy.
You have to go to Nancy. Have to, And then go buy yourself a beautiful object in one of the places there. I mean, you can get them in other stores. I mean, fine objects are, these are objects that are sold. You can even get a teeny little piece, made by Dome or Gallet.
Right.
But they still reproduce. They're known for still producing the same style as 100 years ago.
That's cool. That's very good. Thank you so much. I learned a lot.
I wish somebody would hint buy me one of those for Christmas.
I'll have a talk with your husband.
Yeah, go ahead. Good luck.
All right. Thank you very much, Elise.
You're welcome.
It has been a delight talking to you and seeing all your hands curving and
curving,
she's
right.
dancing as she's describing these.
So I just want to wish everybody out there a happy holiday.
Yes, and
a happy new year.
It's a happy new year. That's right. It's a happy new year. By the time you hear this, the Christmas will be done. So.
Right, and let's hope that the next year is a good one.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. Let's talk to you next week, everybody. Au revoir.
Bye.
This is the French tip of the week. As you know, French people love food, and we love food so much that we use food-related expressions in everyday language. Here are a couple of them that I think are very enjoyable. En faire tout un fromage. For instance, you could say, mais il faut pas en faire tout un fromage, meaning, don't make a big deal out of this. Don't make it into a big cheese. Another one that is very funny is c'est bête comme chou. C'est bête comme chou, meaning that's really easy to do. So it's going to be something like utiliser un iPhone, c'est bête comme chou. And that means it's stupid as a cabbage. If Join Us in France makes your life happier and your trip planning easier, let us know by joining the mailing list, subscribing to the podcast, reviewing the show on iTunes, sharing status updates on Facebook, or sending in a donation. Merci beaucoup.